I'm not going to be referring much to the scriptures. Matter of fact, not at all in the sermon. So, would anyone have an idea why I chose the ones I did? What about the first one? What was it?
Taking the land.
Taking someone else's land. Okay, what about the second one? Those are the things you should do. Shouldn't do, should do. Okay, that's how it goes. All right, it is estimated there were about 10 million Native Americans living in North America when the Europeans arrived. In the 300 years that followed, 90% of the native population was wiped out due to disease, famine, or warfare with white Europeans. During the colonial period, 250,000, a quarter of a million native peoples from 85 tribes lived in the lands between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. White people kept wanting more and more land, and a policy was held that Indians could stay on their land as long as they became civilized, meaning that they adopt white people's ways, and also allowed white settlers to buy parts of their land. If they could not meet these standards, then they would have to be moved away from whites. President Washington, Secretary of State Henry Knox, and Thomas Jefferson all believed that all people were equal, but they also believed that Indians could and should learn to be like white people, settling down on the land to become farmers. And there was perhaps no tribe that better succeeded in doing this than the Cherokee. The Cherokee were considered by the whites as one of the 5 civilized Indian tribes. The Cherokees earned this title because a majority of them adopted white people's ways. They became Christians, they dressed like white people, they settled down on farms like whites, built houses, schools, hospitals, and meeting houses in the style of European people. And they even changed some of their traditional roles between men and women, basically demoting women to be in a more subservient role, to be more like white people. But perhaps the most remarkable thing in order to be called civilized is that there was this brilliant man by the name of Sequoyah. He had created a syllabary so that the Cherokee language could be written. Because of that, the written language, the Cherokee language, their history and practices could be recorded for future generations to learn. Now, the Cherokee people believed that the Creator of all things had given them their ancestral land. It included the northern parts of Georgia. I don't know how well you can see that, but you get an idea. Northern parts of Georgia and Alabama, most of Tennessee and Kentucky, the western parts of North and South Carolina, and a little bit of Virginia. But the Cherokee had sided with their trading partner, Britain, during the Revolutionary War. And afterwards, many whites took vengeance on the Cherokee for their mistaken loyalties by committing violence on them and stealing their possessions and property. In the early 1800s, many whites were thinking that the civilization program, as it was called, of the Indians was not working fast enough. And after the purchase of the Louisiana Territory, there was an ever-increasing call by whites to move Indians west past the Mississippi River. This call was heard loudest from white southern plantation owners who saw the rich farmland of the Cherokee that they owned and they wanted it for themselves. Many Cherokee were cotton plantation owners themselves, and if the Cherokee were moved, well, then many whites would have a ready-made farmland and houses to take over. Of course, there is nothing like wanting something that someone else has to take away that someone else's humanity. You didn't get that, no. Okay. Basically, other people become things when they are in the way of getting what you want. That's better. Okay. For whites, the Indians were simply things to get rid of. 2 Cherokees who were great believers in the civilization program were Elias Bodenau and John Ridge. In 1817, they went to Cornwall, Connecticut, to the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions Missionary School, the school that has been established by the Congregational Church, which is a history for both of our congregations. And they had already sent missionaries to the Cherokee Nation, but Boudinot and Ridge were the first natives to go there, and they were welcomed with open arms until they fell in love with a couple of girls from town. And at one point, protests reached the point of burning an effigy of one of the girls, and the women's choir of the other, that the other one sang in, well, they all wore black armbands to symbolize that she was dead to them. So, Boudinot and Ridge learned that they were never going to be considered equal to whites. Yet, even with this horrible experience, they still believed that the civilization program was a good one. And they returned to their home and became prominent in the Cherokee community. And in 1828, Boudinot began the Cherokee Phoenix newspaper. All right, back up a year. 1827. The Cherokee wrote a constitution for their nation which resembled the United States Constitution. The significant thing to mention about their constitution at this time is that it was made illegal for any Cherokee to sell land without the Cherokee Council's approval. That's because land was being sold at an ever-increasing pace. Then, gold was discovered in Georgia, and it began the first American gold rush. Whites poured into Georgia. Georgia then passed laws denying the Cherokee any civil rights. The legislature made it illegal for Indians to dig for gold or to express any kind of dissent. And they revoked the titles to any land that the Cherokee owned. They seized it, and then they started selling it themselves. Well, Cherokee went to the U.S. courts to protest. And while this was going on, 1 year into his first term, President Andrew Jackson signed into law the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which called for the moving of native populations who were east of the Mississippi to the west of the Mississippi, and especially the Oklahoma Territory. In 1832, Supreme Court Justice John Marshall wrote for the majority that no state could restrict the rights of any citizen, and thus struck down the action of the state of Georgia and the American Indian Removal Act. But most of Jackson's supporters came from southern whites who wanted Indian land, so Jackson defied the Supreme Court decision, saying, Marshall has made his ruling, let's see him enforce it. And although Cherokee, such as John Ridge, went to plead with Jackson, Jackson told the Cherokee that their only hope was to move west, and he presented their removal as a benevolent act to save their culture. Now, at this point, Elias Boudinot and John Ridge believed that whites were going to take their land no matter what, and nothing was going to stop them. So Elias Boudinot, John Ridge, and John Ridge's father, Major Ridge, led a group of Cherokee called the Treaty Party to negotiate with the U.S. government for their removal. In 1835, out of more than 16,000 Cherokee, only 300 ratified what became known as the Treaty of New Echota, the town in which the treaty was negotiated. The U.S. government approved the treaty in 1836, and according to the treaty, the Cherokee were to be moved to Oklahoma in 2 years. How are you doing so far? Okay? So you can imagine with such a small group of Cherokee signing the Treaty of New Echota that most of the others would be very upset with that treaty party. And one of the most upset people was the principal chief of the Cherokee, John Ross, who was excluded from any treaty negotiations altogether. That would be like Bill Gates making international treaties for the United States without consulting the President of the United States. Violence broke out among the Cherokee. Now, by this time, other southeastern tribes had already been removed to the west. The Seminole, Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Creek were all forcibly moved west of the Mississippi. But in the spring of 1838, only 2,000 Cherokee had gone west, primarily of their own volition. President Jackson sent 2,000 U.S. troops to enforce the evacuation under the command of John Wool. Wool was sympathetic to the Cherokee plight, but he was under orders from his commander-in-chief, and he followed them as humanely as he could. But still, the Cherokee were forced from their homes. They were herded off into stockades to await their removal to the west. The roundup in Georgia was especially cruel, with forcing Cherokee out of their homes at bayonet point with only the clothes on their backs. Whites would then go in, they would steal the personal items, take their houses, rob even the graves of the silver jewelry that the Cherokee had. While in the stockades and internment camps, food and what little supplies there was of poor quality, as government contractors sought to make better profits at the Indians' expense. Many Cherokees died of disease and famine before they even started the walk west. In 1838, the new president, Martin Van Buren, thought things were going too slow and ordered General Winfield Scott to take over. But there was a severe drought in the summer of 1838, and the roundup slowed. The principal chief, John Ross, asked Scott if the Cherokee could remove themselves in the fall, and the general agreed. Government issued money to John Ross and his brother Lewis for provisions for the 800-mile walk west. The project was grossly underfunded. John Ross divided up the 14 to 15,000 Cherokee, we don't have exact numbers, into 13 groups of 1,000 to 1,300 in each group. And 10% of these people were blacks, freed and slaves. Each group had a conductor, assistant conductor, a doctor, wagon master, interpreter, and commissary agent. So the Army was not with them the whole time. They did start them out, and they would periodically have to report to forts, and they did escort them at times, but not for the whole trip. So there was actually four different trails, not just one. And we got the trails up? All right. So they all start off pretty close over there in Alabama and Georgia and Tennessee. Ross used the northern trail, while another was the Bengies Trail and another was Bell's Trail, and some went by boats on rivers. The waterway was quickest, being about 3 weeks, until the severe drought made the river passage impossible. The land groups were 3.5 months on the road in the worst part of winter. The people had to sleep in wagons or on the ground without fires. Sickness was epidemic. Many people had to be buried alongside the trail. Some simply died where they fell because others were too sick and too weak to help. Estimates vary, but most records state that 4,000 Cherokee died on what has become called the Trail of Tears. More died when they reached Oklahoma because of exhaustion and lack of food and supplies when they got there. So in total, at least 1/4 of the Cherokee population died in the removal. But the troubles were not over. Political rivalries flourished in Oklahoma. There had been Cherokee living there since 1807, and they had already formed their government. Then came the first wave of the Treaty Party in 1837. They formed a government, and they had their own ideas. And then in 1839, the vast majority of Cherokee, supported by the principal chief John Ross, arrived. So on June 22nd of 1839, Elias Boudinot, John, and Major Ridge were all assassinated. Most people believe that John Ross did not order this, but it was part of an extreme faction of Ross's supporters that had done it. The sad thing is that the Treaty Party of Boudinot and Ridge and the supporters of principal chief, John Ross, wanted the same goal. And the goal was to save the Cherokee people. They had different ideas of how to save the people, but they were both sincere in their desire to keep the Cherokee from going extinct. There was no good guy or bad guy among the Cherokee leadership. The Cherokee people suffered internal struggles, but their treatment by the whites was appalling. People believed that the U.S. government and their tribal leadership had turned against them in creating this tragedy. A contemporary Cherokee leader remarked that the Cherokee did not have the moral or ethical ability to deal with the inequity of the situation. They did not have an answer for it. The Cherokee did all that they could legally and morally to preserve themselves on their land where their ancestors had lived for thousands of years and were buried. But they could not stand against overwhelming greed and the abuse of power. Historian Richard White once wrote, "The Cherokee are probably the most tragic instance of what could have succeeded in American Indian policy and didn't. All these things that Americans would proudly see as the hallmarks of civilization are going to the West by Indian people. They do everything that is asked of them except one thing. What the Cherokees ultimately are, they may be Christian, they may be literate, they may have a government like ours, but ultimately they are Indians. And in the end, being Indian is what kills them, because most whites just can't accept them as equals." Amen.